The cold morning mist rose over the battlefields of France, where the fates of nations were being decided. It was the 14th century, and the 100 Years' War ravaged Europe. The rivalry between France and England, intensified by territorial and dynastic disputes, turned nights into legends and battlefields into stages of tragedy. Majestic castles stood as unbreakable fortresses, guarding kings and nobles who shaped the destiny of their people. Amidst this era of chaos, honor was a valuable currency, and the Code of Chivalry guided the actions of those who donned armor. However, the brutal reality of war often subverted the ideals of bravery, loyalty, and compassion. The French knight, Sir Geoffrey de Charny, renowned for his Book of Chivalry, was at the center of this internal struggle between honor and the brutality of war. Charny, an experienced knight, was seen as the living embodiment of the chivalric code, always faithful to his country and faith. The tension between his duty as a soldier and his chivalric ideals was constant. In contrast, Sir John Chandos, an equally renowned English knight, personified military prowess, never hesitating to adopt ruthless tactics to secure victory. This rivalry between the two knights was forged in the blood-soaked fields of the 100 Years' War. Their swords clashed many times, and each battle reinforced the contrast between Charny's romantic ideals and Chandos' pragmatic approach. Yet both were products of an era when chivalry was in transition, with the rise of the English longbow and new military tactics challenging traditional knighthood. The story begins at a grand tournament held in Paris in 1350, where nobles and knights gathered to showcase their bravery. The tournament was a celebration of chivalric ideals, but also a stage for displays of power and rivalry. Among the spectators was Isabelle de Valois, a lady of the French court who embodied the courtly ideal of chivalry. Sir Geoffrey and Sir John competed fiercely, and despite their differences, both sought to impress the court and maintain their reputations. The tournament, with its splendor and pomp, contrasted with the horrors of the battles that would soon follow. To Charny, that event symbolized what chivalry should be, but he knew that the battlefield offered a far different reality. Shortly after, Sir Geoffrey de Charny began writing his Book of Chivalry, a work meant to reflect on the true values of a knight. He questioned how he could apply his ideals of honor and loyalty amidst the brutality he witnessed. During the siege of Calais, Charny watched in horror as atrocities were committed by both sides, against everything he believed. Even the Black Prince, Edward, heir to the English throne and famous for his military skill, did not hesitate to use dishonorable tactics to secure victory. In a critical moment, Charny found himself face to face with Chandos, and to his surprise, he witnessed an unexpected act of mercy from the English knight, causing him to further question the limits of chivalry. During the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, Charny was forced to make a crucial decision. With the French forces at a disadvantage, he could abandon the chivalric code to ensure his army's survival. But as a man of honor, Charny chose to face the consequences of his actions. On that day, he sacrificed his life for his ideals, dying with a sword in hand, but at peace with himself for remaining true to his word. Charny's death marked the end of an era, a time when knights still believed that honor and bravery could prevail over the brutality of war. The 100 Years' War would continue for decades, but chivalry as an ideal would never be the same. From then on, the ideals of chivalry, often subverted by the cruel realities of war, began to fragment. New military technologies and strategies rendered the traditional knight obsolete, and the English longbow, with its deadly range, shattered the dominance of knights on the battlefield. Yet the legacy of chivalry survived. Even though the code was not always followed to the letter, it continued to inspire generations. In castles and royal courts, stories of bravery and loyalty were told, and the chivalric code became an aspirational ideal, more a symbol of nobility than a military practice. And so, amidst the chaos and destruction of war, the flame of chivalry continued to burn, even if only in spirit. In the heart of 14th century France, amidst the sweeping fields of wheat and the towering silhouettes of castles, Sir Geoffrey de Charny stood as a paragon of chivalry. Born into a noble family, Geoffrey was a man of profound ideals, guided by the ancient code that every knight swore to uphold: honor, bravery, loyalty, and piety. His life was dedicated to the principles of knighthood, and his Book of Chivalry was a testament to his unwavering belief in the virtues that defined a true knight. However, as war ravaged the lands, Geoffrey found himself constantly torn between the brutal realities of battle and the lofty ideals he cherished. The 100 Years' War, a seemingly endless conflict between England and France, would test not only his physical prowess but also the very essence of his moral compass. Across the Channel, Sir John Chandos, a knight in service to the English crown, rose to prominence under the leadership of Edward, the Black Prince. Chandos was as much a man of war as Geoffrey, but he viewed the battlefield with a pragmatic eye. Where Geoffrey sought honor in every swing of the sword, Chandos sought victory. His loyalty to Edward was unwavering, and his primary motivation was the success of his king's cause, even if it meant bending or breaking the chivalric code. Chandos respected the knightly ideals but believed that the world had no room for them in their purest form. For him, survival and conquest came first, and the rules of war were dictated by necessity, not by ancient oaths. This pragmatic approach to chivalry placed him in direct conflict with Geoffrey, who struggled to reconcile his ideals with the horrors he witnessed on the battlefield. Isabelle de Valois, a lady of the French court, was the embodiment of courtly grace and the unspoken influence of women in the culture of chivalry. Her beauty and intelligence made her a coveted figure in the royal courts, where knights and nobles alike sought her favor. Isabelle believed deeply in the ideals of chivalry, not only as a code for knights but as a moral compass for all of society. She understood that knights, like Geoffrey, fought for honor and country, but she also saw the toll that war took on them. While her position at court kept her far from the battlefields, she held the power to sway the minds of knights through her influence and counsel. For Geoffrey, Isabelle represented the very heart of the chivalric code, a reminder that his actions were not just for glory but for the greater good of his people. However, Isabelle also saw the pragmatic side of war through figures like Chandos, and she knew that the true test of a knight was not only in battle but in navigating the complexities of honor in a world at war. Then there was Edward, the Black Prince, heir to the English throne and one of the most feared military commanders of the era. Edward was a man of contradiction. He embodied the ideals of chivalry when it suited him but did not hesitate to employ brutal tactics when necessary. His military genius was undeniable, but his methods often left the battlefield soaked in blood and his enemies in ruin. Geoffrey admired Edward for his bravery and skill, yet was deeply disturbed by the prince's willingness to forsake the chivalric code when it served his purposes. Edward's motivations were clear. He sought to secure his legacy as a conqueror, to etch his name in history as the one who brought France to its knees. The contrast between Edward's public persona as a chivalrous knight and his private ruthlessness only deepened Geoffrey's internal conflict. How could a man revered as the epitome of knighthood commit such atrocities in the name of victory? As the war raged on, these four figures found their fates intertwined in the blood-soaked fields of France. Geoffrey, bound by his belief in the purity of knighthood, struggled with the realities of war that seemed to mock his ideals at every turn. In one brutal campaign after another, Geoffrey witnessed the very essence of chivalry being eroded by the harshness of combat. His encounters with Chandos only heightened his frustration, as the English knight's success on the battlefield, unencumbered by moral dilemmas, contrasted starkly with Geoffrey's own internal strife. Chandos, meanwhile, saw Geoffrey as a relic of a bygone age, honorable but naive. Yet, there was an unspoken respect between the two, for while their approaches differed, they were both knights, bound by the same ancient code, even if interpreted differently. Isabelle, watching from the safety of the court, became increasingly aware of the personal toll the war was taking on Geoffrey. She admired his dedication to the chivalric ideals, but she feared that his rigidity might lead to his downfall. In private moments, she would counsel him, urging him to understand that sometimes, honor required flexibility. War was not just a contest of ideals, it was a matter of survival, of protecting those who could not defend themselves. Isabelle's influence was a constant reminder to Geoffrey that his actions were not just for his own soul, but for the future of France itself. Edward, however, saw no need for such internal conflict. For him, the battlefield was where chivalry was tested and proven, but also where it could be discarded when it became a hindrance. He respected Geoffrey for his skill and dedication but viewed his moral struggles as weakness. In Edward's eyes, a knight was defined by his victories, and the true measure of honor was found in results, not in the purity of one's soul. As the Black Prince continued to lead his forces to victory, Geoffrey's admiration for Edward turned to disillusionment. How could a man who was supposed to represent the pinnacle of chivalry be so willing to compromise its most sacred tenets? The climax of their intertwined fates came at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. On that fateful day, Geoffrey stood on the front lines, his sword ready, his heart heavy with doubt. Chandos led the English forces with ruthless efficiency, while Edward commanded with a brilliance that had made him a legend. Geoffrey, faced with the brutal reality of war, was forced to confront his deepest fears. Could he remain true to the chivalric code he had devoted his life to? Or would the realities of war force him to compromise, as Chandos and Edward had done so many times before? The choices made on that battlefield would forever alter the course of history, not just for France and England, but for the very concept of knighthood itself. The year was 1350, and Paris was alive with the sound of excitement and anticipation. The great tournament, held in honor of King John II of France, was a spectacle unlike any other. Knights from across the realm, including the most celebrated figures of the time, gathered to prove their valor and skill in front of the court's nobility. The tournament grounds were surrounded by banners fluttering in the wind, the vibrant colors of the French nobility contrasting against the cold, stone walls of the city. The crowd buzzed with expectation as the trumpets announced the arrival of Sir Geoffrey de Charny. Renowned for his honor, Charny was the embodiment of the chivalric ideals, a knight whose life was dedicated to the pursuit of glory through noble deeds. At the tournament, Charny faced fierce competition, but none more formidable than Sir John Chandos, a famed English knight. Their rivalry was palpable, a symbol of the larger conflict brewing between their nations. The clash of their swords in the arena echoed the tensions of the 100 Years' War. Chandos, with his pragmatic view of warfare, represented a stark contrast to Charny's idealism. The tournament was not just a display of skill, it was a demonstration of what chivalry could be, noble, honorable, and grand. But as Charny fought that day, a nagging doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Was this display of chivalry an illusion, a facade that masked the brutal reality of warfare? In the quiet hours after the tournament, Charny began to put pen to parchment, composing his Book of Chivalry. His thoughts were filled with the lofty ideals of knighthood, bravery, loyalty, honor, and piety, but also with the disturbing contrast he had witnessed on the battlefield. The tournament had been a controlled display of chivalric ideals, but war was something different entirely. As he wrote, Charny wrestled with a question that haunted him. Could these ideals survive the brutality of war? His encounters with men like Chandos, who viewed chivalry as a tool to be bent to their will, only deepened his doubts. The knightly code that had guided his life seemed increasingly distant from the realities he faced. Charny's internal struggle intensified during the siege of Calais later that year. The French army, led by King John II, sought to reclaim the strategic city from the English, and Charny played a crucial role in the assault. The siege was brutal and long, testing the endurance of both sides. As the days dragged on, Charny witnessed acts of cruelty and desperation that shook his faith in the chivalric code. The lines between right and wrong blurred on the battlefield, where survival often took precedence over honor. Chandos, commanding the English forces, showed little concern for the chivalric ideals Charny held dear. He used every tactic at his disposal, deception, ambush, and ruthlessness, to maintain control of Calais. In one pivotal moment, Charny, leading a charge against the English fortifications, was forced to retreat under a hail of arrows, the longbowmen decimating his forces. It was clear that the traditional knightly tactics were no match for the evolving face of warfare. During the siege, Charny's perception of chivalry was further tested when he witnessed an act of mercy from Chandos. Despite his ruthless reputation, the English knight spared a group of captured French soldiers, an action that confounded Charny. Could it be that even in the chaos of war, there was still room for honor? Or was this act a strategic move, designed to foster goodwill among the enemy? Charny's doubts about the true nature of chivalry deepened as he struggled to reconcile these conflicting images. The code that had once seemed so clear now appeared riddled with contradictions. Charny's internal conflict mirrored the changing nature of warfare itself. The siege ended in a bitter stalemate, with neither side claiming a decisive victory, but the psychological toll on Charny was far more significant. The turning point for Charny came at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the French forces, led by King John II, faced a devastating defeat at the hands of Edward, the Black Prince. As the armies clashed on the battlefield, Charny found himself once again confronting the harsh realities of war. The chivalric ideals he had devoted his life to seemed powerless in the face of the English longbowmen, whose deadly volleys cut through the French knights with brutal efficiency. The once mighty French cavalry, bound by tradition and the code of chivalry, was no match for the evolving tactics of warfare. Charny fought valiantly, but as the battle raged on, he knew that the age of knights, as he had known it, was coming to an end. In the chaos of Poitiers, Charny faced a moment of truth. As the French lines crumbled and King John was captured, Charny was given a choice: uphold the chivalric code and die with honor, or abandon it in a desperate attempt to survive. He chose the former, leading a final charge against the English forces. Charny died on the battlefield that day, his body falling among the countless others who had fought and perished in the name of honor and country. His death marked the end of an era, not just for France, but for the concept of knighthood itself. After Poitiers, the legacy of chivalry would be forever changed. The battles of the Hundred Years' War, particularly the defeats at Calais and Poitiers, highlighted the obsolescence of the knightly code in the face of new military technologies and strategies. The longbow, a symbol of the future of warfare, rendered the heavily armored knights vulnerable. Yet, despite the changes in the nature of combat, the ideals of chivalry would continue to live on in legend and lore. Geoffrey de Charny's Book of Chivalry remained a testament to the virtues that had once defined an era. Though the reality of war had proven too harsh for those ideals to survive intact, they persisted in the hearts of those who still believed in honor, loyalty, and bravery. In the end, Charny's life and death stood as a reflection of the transition from the old world to the new. His struggles with the contradictions of chivalry mirrored the broader changes sweeping across medieval Europe. The age of knights was fading, but the ideals they had championed would continue to shape the culture and history of the continent for centuries to come. Charny's story was not just one of personal conflict, but of the end of an era, where the values of chivalry, though no longer practical, remained a beacon of hope in a world increasingly governed by pragmatism and war. The 14th century was a time of profound tension between ideals and realities, nowhere more evident than in the life of a knight. Sir Geoffrey de Charny, a figure revered for his adherence to the chivalric code, lived at a time when the noble virtues of honor, loyalty, and bravery were being tested in the harshest crucible of all war. The Hundred Years' War between France and England placed these ideals in direct conflict with the brutal realities of the battlefield. For men like Charny, war was no longer the glamorous, noble pursuit depicted in tales of King Arthur, but a gruesome struggle for survival where the code of chivalry seemed increasingly out of place. Charny believed deeply in the chivalric ideals that had been instilled in him since his youth. As a knight, he was bound by a code that emphasized protecting the weak, defending the faith, and upholding justice. However, as he rode into battle during the Hundred Years' War, the realities of warfare began to challenge these principles. The fields of France, once places of agriculture and prosperity, became desolate landscapes strewn with bodies, where mercy and honor were often overshadowed by the need for victory at any cost. Charny found himself torn between his duty as a knight and the necessity to win by any means necessary, a conflict that plagued many of his peers. He witnessed knights, once noble protectors, resorting to plundering villages, killing innocents, and committing acts that violated the very code they swore to uphold. The role of religion in the chivalric code cannot be understated. For Charny, his faith was central to his understanding of knighthood. The Church promoted the idea that knights were defenders of the Christian faith, protectors of Christendom against heretics and infidels. The concept of the holy warrior was deeply ingrained in the minds of knights, and religious rituals surrounded their every action. Before every battle, knights would hear Mass, seek blessings, and pray for divine favor. However, Charny began to question how these religious principles aligned with the increasingly brutal nature of war. Could a knight truly serve God while engaging in acts of violence and destruction? The Church itself was not without contradictions, often sanctioning wars and bloodshed in the name of faith, yet preaching mercy and compassion. Charny's internal struggle reflected a broader tension within medieval society: how to reconcile the call for piety with the demands of warfare. One of the greatest challenges to the chivalric code in the 14th century came from the evolution of military tactics. The traditional image of the knight as a mounted warrior, clad in armor and wielding a sword, was becoming obsolete in the face of new technologies. The English longbow, with its range and power, was a deadly weapon that could decimate cavalry charges long before knights could engage in close combat. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, Charny saw firsthand how the heavily armored knights of France were brought low by these new tactics. The battlefield, once dominated by the nobility on horseback, was now shared with common foot soldiers and archers, whose effectiveness challenged the very foundations of the knightly class. Charny recognized that the age of the knight was in jeopardy, as the evolution of military strategies and weaponry eroded the dominance that chivalry once held on the battlefield. Yet, amidst the chaos of war, the ideals of chivalry persisted, especially in the courts of nobility, where the role of women played a crucial part in shaping the culture of knighthood. Figures like Isabelle de Valois represented the courtly aspect of chivalry, where knights were expected to be not only warriors but also gentlemen. Women of noble birth held a unique position in medieval society, often acting as patrons of knights, inspiring them to perform acts of bravery and gallantry. The concept of courtly love, in which knights dedicated their victories and feats to a lady of the court, became intertwined with the ideals of chivalry. For Charny, women like Isabelle were embodiments of the virtues he sought to uphold: grace, purity, and wisdom. They served as a moral compass for knights, reminding them that their deeds were not only for themselves but for the honor of their lady and their court. However, the reality of war often contrasted sharply with the courtly ideals. As knights returned from battle, they brought with them tales of slaughter and survival that had little in common with the romanticized version of knighthood sung by troubadours. The battlefield offered no room for the delicate dance of courtly love, and many knights found themselves torn between their obligations to their ladies and the harsh demands of war. Women, despite their influence, were often powerless to stop the tide of violence that swept through the land. While they maintained the ideals of chivalry within the courts, they could do little to prevent the brutal realities that occurred outside their walls. In Charny's later years, as he reflected on his experiences in war and his role as a knight, he began to question whether the ideals of chivalry could truly survive in the face of evolving military tactics and the changing nature of society. His Book of Chivalry was an attempt to codify the principles he believed in, yet even he acknowledged the challenges knights faced in upholding these ideals. The battlefield had changed. Common soldiers now played a greater role, and the traditional role of the knight was being diminished. Religion, once the foundation of chivalric virtue, seemed increasingly distant from the realities of war. The Code of Chivalry, while noble in theory, was becoming less practical in a world where survival often meant abandoning one's moral compass. Ultimately, the tension between the ideals of chivalry and the brutal realities of war defined Charny's life and legacy. The 100 Years' War exposed the contradictions inherent in the chivalric code. Knights were expected to be both merciful and ruthless, pious and violent, honorable and pragmatic. The influence of religion on chivalry, while powerful, often conflicted with the practical demands of warfare. As military tactics evolved, the role of the knight was increasingly questioned, and the rise of new technologies threatened to render traditional cavalry obsolete. Despite these challenges, the ideals of chivalry persisted, thanks in part to the influence of women like Isabel, who upheld the courtly virtues that knights were expected to embody. In the end, Charny's struggle was not only a personal one but a reflection of the broader conflict between ideals and reality in the Middle Ages. The Code of Chivalry, while noble, was ultimately a product of a world in transition, caught between the old ways of knighthood and the new realities of warfare. Charny's life and writings stand as a testament to the enduring appeal of chivalry, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Though the battlefield may have changed, the ideals of honor, loyalty, and bravery continue to inspire knights, nobles, and women of the court alike, leaving a lasting legacy on the culture of medieval Europe. The 14th century was an era of grandeur and brutality, where the Code of Chivalry governed the lives of knights and the nobility. At the heart of this world was Sir Geoffrey de Charny, a knight whose life epitomized the tension between the ideals of chivalry and the harsh realities of war. The 100 Years' War between France and England provided the backdrop for his struggles, where armored knights clashed in bloody conflicts, and chivalric honor was often overshadowed by survival. But beyond the battlefield, medieval life was filled with rituals, ceremonies, and social gatherings that reinforced the values of the time, from grand banquets to the solemn adubamento of a knight. The armor of a knight in the 14th century was a marvel of craftsmanship, designed not only for protection but also as a symbol of status and power. Sir Geoffrey, like many knights of his time, wore a full suit of plate armor, which covered him from head to toe in finely wrought steel. The helm, or helmet, was often topped with a crest bearing the knight's family insignia, while the cuirass protected his chest with solid, interlocking plates. Beneath this formidable exterior, a padded gambeson and chainmail hauberk provided additional layers of defense. His gauntlets, made of overlapping steel plates, allowed him to grip his sword with precision. Charny's sword, a knight's most trusted companion, was a finely balanced weapon, its double-edged blade honed to perfection, ideal for slashing or thrusting in battle. Alongside his sword, Charny carried a lance, the quintessential knightly weapon used in cavalry charges, designed to unseat opponents with a single, devastating blow. On the battlefield, the tactics of the time were evolving, as the rise of the English longbow began to change the face of warfare. Traditional cavalry charges, where knights in full armor would storm the enemy lines, were being met with lethal volleys of arrows. The longbow, with its superior range and power, could pierce even the strongest armor from a distance, rendering many traditional knightly tactics ineffective. At the Battle of Crécy, for instance, Charny saw firsthand how rows of French knights, clad in heavy armor, were cut down by waves of arrows before they could even reach the English lines. Despite this, the French knights remained committed to the chivalric code, charging headlong into the fray, hoping that their honor and bravery would carry them through the carnage. The clash between old and new tactics left knights like Charny grappling with the changing nature of warfare, as their status as the dominant force on the battlefield was challenged. Yet, life in the Middle Ages was not all bloodshed. Between campaigns, the courts of nobility were filled with moments of splendor and ceremony. Grand banquets were a common feature of noble life, where the finest foods were served in abundance. In the great halls of castles like the Louvre or Château de Vincennes, tapestries adorned the walls, and long wooden tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, breads, and cheeses. Nobles would feast on wild boar, venison, and peacocks, often elaborately prepared and presented as symbols of wealth and status. Wine flowed freely, and minstrels filled the air with music while jesters entertained the guests. For knights like Charny, these banquets were not only a time to indulge but also an opportunity to reinforce alliances, gain favor at court, and honor the traditions of chivalry. The courtly life, with its feasts and tournaments, served as a reminder of the values knights were expected to uphold: loyalty, generosity, and courtesy. One of the most iconic pieces of art from this period, Les Tres Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, the very rich hours of the Duke of Berry, captured the splendor and daily life of medieval nobility. This illuminated manuscript, created in the early 15th century, was commissioned by John, Duke of Berry, and depicted scenes of courtly life, religious festivals, and the changing seasons. The manuscript's intricate illustrations revealed the opulence of the Duke's lifestyle, with its vibrant depictions of banquets, hunts, and religious ceremonies. For knights like Charny, such works were more than just art. They were a reflection of the ideals they aspired to, where duty to God, loyalty to their lord, and devotion to their lady were paramount. Les Tres Riches Heures was not just a chronicle of noble life but a visual embodiment of the chivalric code in action, reinforcing the knight's role in both the earthly and divine order. Central to the life of a knight was the ceremony of knighthood itself, the adubamento, or dubbing, where a young squire was officially made a knight. The ceremony was rich in symbolism and tradition, marking the transition from boyhood to manhood, from service to mastery. A squire, after years of training in the arts of war and chivalry, would kneel before his lord, often in a grand hall or chapel. Before the ceremony, the squire would undergo a night of vigil, fasting and praying in solitude, reflecting on the responsibilities he was about to undertake. Dressed in a simple white tunic to symbolize purity, the squire would then present himself to his lord, who would bless him with a sword and speak the words of the knighthood oath. The lord would tap the squire's shoulders with a sword, a light touch that symbolized both the conferral of rank and the responsibility of wielding such power. The new knight would rise, swearing to defend the weak, uphold justice, and serve his lord faithfully. For Charny, this ceremony was the foundation of his life, a moment he reflected on often, especially as the realities of war tested his commitment to the ideals he had sworn to uphold. As Charny grew older, he became increasingly aware of the changing tides of warfare and the challenges facing the knightly class. The armor and weapons that once symbolized invincibility were now vulnerable to the innovations of war. The banquets and ceremonies that celebrated chivalry seemed ever more distant from the brutal realities he faced on the battlefield. And yet, Charny remained committed to the ideals of knighthood, even as he struggled to reconcile them with the world around him. His Book of Chivalry, written in the midst of these challenges, was not just a manual for knights. It was a reflection of his belief that, despite the changing times, the principles of honor, loyalty, and courage still had a place in the world. The ceremony of knighthood, the grand banquets, and the illuminated manuscripts were all part of a world that Charny feared was slipping away, but that he fought to preserve with every stroke of his sword and every word of his pen. In the end, Charny's life and legacy were a testament to the enduring appeal of chivalry. Despite the evolution of military tactics, the changing nature of warfare, and the rise of new social orders, the ideals of knighthood continued to inspire generations of knights, nobles, and artists alike. The armor, weapons, and rituals of the medieval knight may have changed, but the values they represented, honor, bravery, and loyalty, remained timeless. Charny's devotion to these ideals, even in the face of overwhelming challenges, ensured that the spirit of chivalry would live on, not just in the courts of nobility or the pages of illuminated manuscripts, but in the hearts and minds of all who sought to live by the code. The sound of hooves thundering across the open plain filled the air, shaking the very earth beneath them. Sir Geoffrey de Charny rode at the head of the French knights, his armor gleaming in the early morning light, the heavy clang of metal on metal echoing with every gallop. The smell of sweat, leather, and the dust of the battlefield mixed with the cold, metallic tang of the armor that encased him. His lance was firm in his grip, pointed straight toward the English lines, where archers were already preparing their deadly longbows. Behind the enemy ranks, he could see banners fluttering, marking the positions of English nobles, and at the center, the ominous presence of Sir John Chandos. The two knights had faced each other before, but today, at the Battle of Poitiers, the stakes felt impossibly high. The 100 Years' War had reached its boiling point, and for Charny, this was more than a battle. It was a test of his soul, his faith in the chivalric code. The battlefield was a stark contrast to the world of courtly life that Charny had known. The bright colors of the banners, the noble crests on shields, all seemed muted in the face of the brutal violence about to unfold. As the French knights charged, the arrows rained down. Charny could hear the sharp whistle of the shafts cutting through the air, followed by the thud of arrows striking flesh and metal. To his left, a fellow knight tumbled from his horse, an arrow lodged in the visor of his helmet. Charny gritted his teeth, spurred his horse forward, and pressed on, determined to close the distance and engage the English knights in honorable combat. But as the arrows continued to fall, he could not help but reflect on how the very nature of warfare had changed. Where was the honor in being struck down from a distance, without ever facing your opponent in combat? As the battle raged, Charny's mind wandered to the days of peace in the court of King John II. The great halls of the Louvre had been alive with music, the clatter of plates and goblets as nobles feasted on roasted game, the scent of spiced wine filling the air. Banquets were as much a display of power and wealth as they were of camaraderie. Knights like Charny would recount tales of bravery and gallantry, their voices rising in pride as they told of their deeds in tournaments and on the battlefield. Isabelle de Valois, always seated with grace at the high table, would listen intently, her eyes reflecting admiration, but also curiosity. She had once asked Charny, in a quiet moment, what it truly meant to be a knight. "Is it only bravery in battle?" she had asked, her voice soft, yet piercing. "Or is there more to it? Honor, even when no one is watching?" Charny had hesitated then, unsure how to answer. He knew that bravery in battle was essential, but Isabelle's question had struck a chord. What was a knight's duty when the ideals of honor clashed with the harsh necessities of war? On the battlefield, amidst the chaos, Charny's thoughts returned to that conversation. As he and his men reached the English lines, he locked eyes with Chandos, who stood firm, his sword drawn, ready for the onslaught. For a brief moment, the noise of the battle faded, and Charny found himself thinking of the legendary knights of King Arthur's court, tales he had heard as a boy. The Knights of the Round Table were paragons of virtue, Sir Lancelot's unmatched skill in battle, Sir Gawain's unshakable loyalty, Sir Galahad's quest for the Holy Grail, a symbol of spiritual purity. But this was no Camelot. The ideals of Arthurian legend seemed far removed from the muddy, blood-soaked fields of Poitiers. Charny had always aspired to be like those knights, driven by a code of honor that transcended the battlefield. Yet, here he was, locked in a conflict where victory often required acts that seemed far from honorable. As the battle pressed on, Charny found himself cornered, his horse slain beneath him. He fought on foot, the weight of his armor pulling on his weary limbs. Chandos approached, his expression hard but not without a trace of respect. "You fought well, Charny," Chandos said, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "But tell me, do you still believe in your code? Does honor matter here, when all that awaits is death and defeat?" Charny, panting from exhaustion, gripped his sword tighter. "Honor matters more than ever," he replied, his voice steady. "It is all we have when the battle ends. Without it, we are no better than beasts." Chandos shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And yet, here we are, fighting a war that will be decided not by honor, but by tactics and power. Perhaps the old ways are fading, Charny. Perhaps it is time to let go of these dreams of chivalry." As the two knights clashed, Charny felt the weight of Chandos' words. They were not wrong, but neither were they entirely right. The old ways of knighthood, the Arthurian ideals of honor, duty, and justice, still held meaning for him, even if the world around him seemed intent on abandoning them. The battle was no place for reflection, but Charny could not help but feel the chivalric code slipping away, piece by piece, as each new military tactic, like the longbow, like the ruthless English raids, took its toll. Later, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, Charny sat alone, his armor dented, his body bruised, but his spirit unbroken. Around him, the fields were strewn with the dead and dying, both French and English. The once vibrant banners were now torn and bloodied, a stark reminder of the cost of war. Charny looked down at his sword, the blade reflecting the dimming light of the setting sun. In that moment, he thought again of Arthur and his knights, of the ideals that had once seemed so attainable. He had always believed that a knight's true strength came from his adherence to the code, But now, he wondered if such ideals could survive in a world so brutal and unforgiving. As Charny stood to join the remnants of his forces, he caught sight of Isabelle de Valois in the distance, standing near the French encampment. She had come to witness the battle, as many noble women did, to see the knights she admired in action. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the battlefield seemed to fade away. Isabelle's gaze was one of quiet understanding, as if she knew the weight of the doubts that plagued him. In her, Charny saw the embodiment of courtly love, the ideal that knights like him fought for. Honor not just in battle, but in life. She had once reminded him that true honor was not about victory or defeat, but about the choices a man made when faced with impossible odds. Charny nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of the lesson she had taught him long ago. Though the world around him had changed, and though the ways of knighthood were evolving, he would hold fast to his code. The battlefield may not have been Camelot, but in his heart, Charny still aspired to the ideals of the knights of old. The chivalric code, though battered and bruised by war, would live on in those who, like him, believed that honor was worth fighting for, even when the world said otherwise. The medieval Code of Chivalry, which shaped the lives and actions of knights like Sir Geoffrey de Charny, was not born in isolation. It was deeply influenced by centuries of conflict, religious fervor, and the exchange of ideas across cultures. The Crusades, in particular, left a profound impact on European chivalry, forever altering the way knights saw their role in society and on the battlefield. From the late 11th century onward, waves of Christian knights set out for the Holy Land, driven by the dual motivations of religious devotion and the promise of glory. The Crusades transformed the concept of knighthood from a purely feudal role, serving local lords, into something greater. Defenders of Christendom, warriors for a divine cause. For knights like Charny, who lived long after the last crusade, this legacy still weighed heavily upon them, shaping their understanding of duty, honor, and faith. Charny often reflected on the stories of the Crusades he had grown up hearing. Tales of knights who had traveled to the far reaches of the known world to battle against the infidels and reclaim Jerusalem. The Crusades had infused European chivalry with a sense of religious purpose that went beyond local feudal conflicts. Knights were no longer just vassals fighting for their lord's land. They were soldiers of Christ, tasked with a holy mission. This sense of divine duty remained a core part of the chivalric code, even in Charny's time, during the 100 Years' War. Though the battlefields of France were far from the deserts of the Levant, Charny and his fellow knights carried the weight of this history with them. Every battle, every charge, every act of mercy or brutality was, in some way, a reflection of the ideals that had been shaped by centuries of Crusader knights. But as Charny matured, he also became increasingly aware of the contradictions inherent in these ideals. The Crusades had left Europe with a legacy not only of heroism but also of atrocities. While knights were meant to embody Christian virtues like mercy and justice, the Crusades had seen the mass slaughter of civilians and the sacking of cities like Jerusalem, all in the name of faith. This duality, the knight as both protector and destroyer, haunted Charny, who struggled to reconcile the glorious image of the Crusades with the often brutal reality of war. He had always believed that a knight's role was to defend the weak and uphold justice, but in the heat of battle, those ideals were frequently sacrificed for survival and victory. The influence of the Crusades on European knighthood was also part of a larger, global exchange of ideas. Charny knew that knights were not the only warriors bound by a strict code of honor. Across the world, in Japan, the samurai followed a code that shared many similarities with European chivalry. Known as Bushido, or the Way of the Warrior, the samurai's code emphasized loyalty, honor, and courage, much like the European chivalric code. Both knights and samurai were elite warriors, serving their lords with a fierce sense of duty, and both placed great importance on personal honor, often valuing it above life itself. However, there were also profound differences between the two codes. While European knights were deeply influenced by the Christian faith, samurai followed a mixture of Buddhist, Shinto, and Confucian teachings, which placed a strong emphasis on self-discipline and the acceptance of death as part of life. Charny, who had never traveled beyond the borders of Europe, could only imagine what it might have been like to live as a samurai, but the stories that reached him from distant lands fascinated him. He wondered how a warrior like himself, who lived and died by his sword, would have fared in the courts of Kyoto or on the battlefields of Sengoku-era Japan. The samurai's willingness to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, when dishonored struck him as both foreign and familiar. In many ways, it mirrored the knight's willingness to die for his honor, though such an act was more likely to take place on the battlefield than in a ritual setting. The knight's honor was bound to the church, the lord, and the land, while the samurai's was tied to their lord in a more absolute sense, often demanding a more extreme form of loyalty. Despite the differences between chivalry and bushido, the core principles of both codes, loyalty, bravery, and honor, transcended geography. Knights and samurai alike were expected to serve their masters without question, fight valiantly in battle, and uphold a strict moral code, even in the face of death. This sense of shared purpose made Charny reflect on the universality of honor among warriors. Whether in the castles of France or the palaces of Japan, a true warrior lived and died by their code, regardless of the cultural differences that separated them. As Charny neared the end of his life, he often found himself reflecting on the legacy of knighthood in a global context. The Crusades had opened Europe's eyes to the wider world, bringing back not only stories of battle but also new ideas, technologies, and cultural practices from the East. Charny wondered if, in the future, the world would see knights and samurai meet on the battlefield. What would such an encounter look like? Would they recognize in each other a shared sense of purpose and duty, or would the differences in their codes of honor drive them apart? Ultimately, Charny understood that the code of chivalry, shaped by the Crusades and centuries of European conflict, was not unique in its aspirations. Across the world, warriors had developed their own systems of honor, each reflecting the values of their societies. But the core ideals of loyalty, courage, and justice remained the same. Whether fighting for Christendom or for a Japanese daimyo, the true test of a warrior was not in the battles they fought, but in the way they upheld their code in the face of adversity. For Charny, this was the essence of chivalry, a universal code that transcended borders and cultures, uniting warriors across time and space in their pursuit of honor. As the sun set on the blood-soaked fields of medieval Europe, and the last of the great knights like Sir Geoffrey de Charny fell in battle, the ideals of chivalry lingered, casting a long shadow over the centuries that followed. Though the code of chivalry was often not upheld in the brutal reality of warfare, its principles, honor, loyalty, bravery, and justice, transcended the battlefield and found new life in the ideals of nobility and honor that would shape the future. The chivalric code, born from the chaos of feudal Europe and the religious fervor of the Crusades, had planted the seeds for a vision of what it meant to be truly noble, not just in birth, but in spirit. Chivalry, as Charny knew it, was a paradoxical code. On the one hand, it called for knights to be fierce warriors, capable of great violence in defense of their lords and their lands. On the other hand, it demanded mercy, humility, and piety, traits that often seemed incompatible with the realities of medieval warfare. Knights were expected to be both conquerors and protectors, to show courage on the battlefield and compassion off it. This duality, brutal in action yet noble in intention, reflected the complexities of medieval life. The truth was that chivalry was rarely fully achieved. As Charny himself had witnessed, knights often fell short of the ideals they swore to uphold, driven by the pressures of war, politics, and personal ambition. Yet, despite these failings, the code of chivalry left an indelible mark on European society. In the courts of kings and queens, chivalric ideals were woven into the fabric of noble life. The grand tournaments, the oaths of loyalty, the acts of courtly love, all perpetuated the image of the knight as the epitome of virtue. Even in times of peace, chivalry shaped the way the nobility viewed themselves and their responsibilities. For all its flaws, chivalry provided a moral framework in an age of violence and uncertainty, offering a vision of what it meant to live with honor and integrity. Knights like Charny may not have always lived up to these ideals, but they aspired to them, and in doing so, they set a standard for others to follow. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the role of the knight changed. New technologies, such as gunpowder and cannons, rendered the heavily armored cavalryman obsolete, and the battlefield evolved into something far different from the one Charny had known. But the spirit of chivalry endured. It became less about the literal act of warfare and more about a code of conduct for those in positions of power and influence. The Renaissance ideal of the gentleman was deeply influenced by the chivalric values of the past. Men of noble birth were expected to be not just warriors, but scholars, artists, and patrons of the arts. The Renaissance courtier, like Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, embodied the same ideals of honor, loyalty, and service that knights like Charny had once sworn to uphold. Beyond Europe, the influence of chivalry can be seen in the rise of modern concepts of honor and justice. In the centuries that followed, the chivalric code evolved into the foundation for various military and social codes of conduct. The knight's oath to defend the weak and uphold justice was echoed in the development of military ethics in modern armies. Even today, soldiers swear oaths to protect their country and act with honor in the face of conflict, a direct descendant of the knight's code. Similarly, the concept of noblesse oblige, where those of higher status are expected to act with generosity and care for those less fortunate, finds its roots in the medieval ideals of knighthood. The idea that one's rank and privilege come with responsibilities, not just rights, is a legacy of the chivalric world. The chivalric code also influenced the broader cultural imagination, particularly through literature. The legends of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, tales of chivalric quests and heroic deeds, became timeless stories that inspired generations. These myths, which had fueled the aspirations of knights like Charny, continued to inspire ideals of nobility, sacrifice, and honor long after the Middle Ages had ended. Writers, poets, and playwrights from Shakespeare to Tennyson would draw upon these chivalric themes to explore the complexities of human nature: courage, betrayal, loyalty, and love. In many ways, chivalry transcended its historical context to become a universal symbol of the struggle to live a virtuous life in a world that often challenges those virtues. As Charny reflected in his later years, chivalry was more than a set of rules for knights to follow. It was a way of understanding the world, a belief that there was a higher purpose to life than mere survival. It was about striving for something greater, even when that goal seemed unattainable. The knight's journey, like the quests of the Arthurian legends, was never about perfection, but about the pursuit of ideals that elevated them above the chaos of war and the temptations of power. Charny had seen the failures of chivalry firsthand, but he also believed in its potential to inspire men to be better than they were. The Code of Chivalry, though frequently broken in practice, left an enduring legacy that shaped the future of nobility and honor. Its influence stretched far beyond the medieval battlefield, touching the courts of Renaissance princes, the halls of modern military academies, and the pages of literature. Chivalry may have been an ideal often unmet, but it was an ideal worth striving for, one that reminded humanity of its better nature. For knights like Sir Geoffrey de Charny, the true victory was not in the battles won, but in the legacy of honor and virtue that survived long after the last lance was broken and the last sword was sheathed.